Hello, I think I am live. This is my first time doing any live video on Instagram, so let's see how it goes. I can see people following, so it looks like you can hear me. I am Caoilinn Hughes, and I am going to chat with the wonderful Sarah Perry once she figures out how to join, which will probably oh yes, I can see. It'll work itself out. I am the author of a novel that's officially coming out tomorrow called The Wild Laughter, and I think it should be in bookshops already. The bookshops that are open, I know in the UK, a lot of them are open now. In Ireland, they're kind of just opening one by one. I'm in the Netherlands at the moment. Let me see. Oh, maybe I can add. Go live with Sarah Perry. Add. See if this works.
Hey.
Saving me from the monologue.
Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you. Yes, yes.
Yay! Congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much.
Was today going to be your publication day, or did it have to change? What happened?
It was meant to be, and originally it was meant to be May 7th. Then it was going to be June 25th, then it was going to be July 23rd, and then now it's tomorrow. Today, they're all days meld into one another. I think it's in book.
Yeah. Well, massive congratulations. I think for all of the people who have books out during this, shall we say, interesting time for the world, it's quite a challenging thing, but I'm just so thrilled to be here, and I'm such an enormous fan of the book, which I'm holding together with paper with penetratingly intelligent questions for you. Are you happy for me to begin interrogating you about the nature of your genius?
This is going to be the first time that I'm talking about the book really at length. I think I had about a minute to speak about it on another platform, on the Brilliant Ricochets book club, but I'm there to talk about other books. So I will be discovering whether or not I have anything to say through you.
I'm sure you will. How would you feel about beginning with a bit of a reading?
Oh, yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think your style is so distinctive, and I want to ask you about it. And I think if we can give people a sense, not just of the subject of the book, but of the incredibly stylish and alive and vital way that you've written it, then we can kick off with a real demonstration of what you've done to us.
Okay. I will, well, I had another little section that I had thought of, but maybe not for just this minute. Maybe I'll just read the opening paragraph.
Lovely. Yeah.
The night the chief died, I lost my father, and the country lost a battle it wouldn't confess to be fighting. For the no-collared labouring class, for the decent, dependable patriarch, for right of entry from the field into the garden. Jurors were appointed to gauge the casualty. They didn't wear black. Don't they know black is flattering? The truth isn't. They kept safe and silent. I didn't. When is a confession an absolution? And when is it a sentencing? I'd like to find out. I suppose there's only one outcome for souls like us. Heavy-going souls, the like of mine, and the long-lost chief, and not a good one. But I'll lay it on the line, if only to remind the people of who they are. A far cry from neutral, judicial equipment. Determining the depth of rot that's blackening the surface can't always be left to deities and legislators. Sometimes what's needed is to tie a string around the tooth and shut the door lively.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And did you know some of that by heart? It seemed to me you were reciting some of it.
I think I probably know the whole book by heart. It's been a long time in the work, so.
Yeah. That kind of makes sense to me because I want to talk more about your prose style later, but it has a genuinely lyrical quality in the sense of a kind of musicality to it, which I think would lend itself to memorizing and repeating. So yeah, I can well imagine you one day reciting it. If the end times really have come and we can't get hold of copies of your book, you can recite it to the passing hordes. So we've already talked about the situation that leads to us sitting in our respective studies and talking through the magic of the internet. And it brought to mind an article that was in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago about writers reworking their novels that they're working on now to talk specifically about the coronavirus. And I had some real qualms because I tend to feel that an adequate kind of grappling with the contemporary requires patience and requires time. And this novel deals very specifically with the outcome on a national and domestic level of the 2008 crash in Ireland, which your debut novel also alluded to. Before I ask you more about that, can you tell the thousands of people watching a kind of potted description of what your book is about?
Okay, let's see how this goes. It is a state of the nation family saga, love story, drama set in the Midlands in Ireland on a potato farm. And the narrator is called Doherty, Hart for short, and he is working the farm, living at home because his father is ailing and the farm is bankrupt. And he has one sibling who has gone off to university, the first person in his family to go to university, and has become an entrepreneur. And the two brothers have a fierce rivalry, but they have to come together to make a really, really difficult decision, and that will affect the future of the family. So in terms of plot, there is, it's a little bit difficult not to kind of spoil it, but thematically, thematically, I think we're going to get a sense of that over the discussion. But certainly there's kind of cowardice and or the challenge of bravery and kind of repressed masculinity in and love. The devastating impact of love and trying to maintain that. And also, I think the desire to control your own narrative. That's something I'm somehow always end up writing about. Cowardice and cynicism and all that stuff are always in there too.
So are you able to identify what it is that has pulled you towards this catastrophic economic situation in Ireland? Because it's 12 years ago now, you're very young still. I assume it occurred in the kind of formative part of your life when you were beginning to become more politically engaged. And it's very striking to me that it's now, and in your previous novel, that you're able to write about it and to take this kind of long view, which was why I was thinking about the danger in writing about things urgently and at the time, because there is so much in the wonderful thing about this novel, of the many wonderful things, is that you move from the very, very particular domestic, individual, granular effects of a national catastrophe all the way up to the kind of political sphere. And I wonder if you think that does take time and that you need time to kind of sift through it.
Absolutely. I mean, I was just remembering this anecdote recently that in 1847, during the Irish famine, The Economist had published an editorial about Ireland and the problem at the time, and it said that essentially there was culpability on the part of the people, and that they had kind of lost the run of themselves, and they're unless there's a state of control, there can't be prosperity. So state civilization. And so it was kind of, and that was kind of an early example of neoliberal thinking, in the sense of let the market resolve itself. The people they'll have to learn from this. There will be loss. I think I think it said something about that melancholy, a melancholy truth is the fact that the innocent suffer along with the guilty. So there was this kind of market response, and of course, people starved. So it's weird that, these things are endlessly relevant, and kind of the immediate moment of, for example, something like the pandemic, would probably be relevant in 1,000 years. If we're well, unlikely to be around then. So for me, I mean, I don't really try and think about maybe the moment that I'm in currently, but the moment of even 10 years ago still feels very contemporary to me. It still feels, that it needs processing, and I think when you write a novel, you're trying to process a moment. And that was certainly that's been happening in Ireland, because I often forget that I don't know if most of the listeners here will be listening from the UK, but the unique thing about the crash in Ireland was that Ireland had been the poor cousin in Europe throughout the 70s and 80s. And it was only in the 90s that they had this really sharp economic wealth. And it had to do with a number of different things. But in particular, investment in financial products. We all know those slippery things now in IT, in medical devices. And also there was EU infrastructure investment. So there was all of a sudden, really a country that had been very poor had this rapid period of growth, unlike anything we've really ever seen. And as a result, there wasn't enough time in the moment to process this new self, to create a kind of identity in this moment of, increased wages and increased, endless credit. And it's, so the idea that you could get wealthy just by having capital, and that actually you were better off to just make capital off your capital, rather than work and worry about making money from working, from labor. And that kind of took hold, and it wasn't processed at the time. And so after the crash in 2008, there was a big reckoning, in Ireland, with whether or not people had been culpable in that, whether their greed, and consumerism and an acquisitive nature, maybe from having been colonized or whatever else, that was coming out, and that there was a sense of national shame. And so it took really a good, several years for the country to develop a narrative about that, and the narrative was really problematic. So this is just a long way of answering to that question of processing the moment that you're in.
Yes, absolutely. And you talked a little bit about identity, and about the nature of the identity that altered very suddenly when you had this country whose identity had been considered a kind of, like you say, one of the poorer countries in Europe, and then suddenly there were all these extraordinary investment opportunities. Before I carry on, we've got a couple of comments from people saying that the sound is bad, so I'm just moving my phone slightly in the hope that it might release the speaker. I've never done one like this before, so apologies to people who can't hear. But while we're talking about Irish identity, can I just read to you one of the lines from the book that seemed to kind of strike me as being something that you were kind of grappling with? So this is rather towards the end. Somebody says, Ireland is where strange tales begin and happy endings are possible, which seemed to kind of encapsulate what you were doing with this novel, which is, it's an Irish book. It's a book which insists on the particular identity of Irish literature and of Irish language, right down to the prose style being a mix of a kind of English dialect and also parts of Irish which you translate in different ways. There's a great line about being full of sorrow, or I have sorrow on me. How much do you think of this as being specifically an Irish novel, as very distinct from a novel in the English language?
I just don't think there's such a thing as a novel in the English language. I think it's always, you can't write outside the reality of your, you know, the context of your life as a writer, and out of the context of, you know, if I haven't taught writing a lot in my life, but whenever I have, and I've taught the class on setting. It's the one thing, the one aspect of prose that you can't avoid. You can get rid of characters, you can have stories that have no plot, you can have stories that are, you know, really restrained in terms of voice and language, that are dry, historical, you know, like an encyclopedia. But setting is impossible to avoid. The only person who tried, I think, to take that to its extreme was Beckett, and he has a play called Not I, and it's just a mouth that speaks this kind of gibberish in blacked out space. So it's a really focused spotlight on the mouth, and this is to devoid the mouth of any context. And it's amazing because that black space becomes omnipresent, you know, and so you can't, I just don't think you can write outside of context. So I mean, I think it's a little, I suppose, I mean, I moved out of the Republic of Ireland when I was 16. I moved to Northern Ireland to study for 4 or 5 years, and then I moved to New Zealand for 7 years, where I wrote the first draft of this, and I've been in the Netherlands for 6 years. So I mean, I am an Irish writer in that, you know, that early reading was so formative, and it was very heavy on the Irish side. But I hope that it's as rich for a reader outside of Ireland and outside of that context. I can't know that. But I mean, the idea of kind of upward mobility and downward mobility is kind of universal. So even the, you know, the idiosyncrasies of the crash, you know, have their own national iterations. I mean, it is Irish in the sense that the style, for example, you tend to Irish authored books tend to have an interest in language that is more than a monocultural interest. That already doesn't feel fair on monocultural writers or on monolingual writers, because you can have your own ways of making a polyphony out of one language. But in any case, if you're brought up, you have to study Irish, the Irish language, to matriculate. So to go to college, to finish school, you have to study Irish until you're 18. So you do kind of have that consciousness that the way that you interpret the world isn't authoritative, that another language might have a better, or, you know, a more true authority on something. So that's there, and I think that is maybe part of the, you know, what classifies or helps to make a novel feel particularly Irish. I'm not sure.
Do you think that living so far away from Ireland while you were doing the first draft lent an almost kind of enchanted or mythic quality to the book? I ask this because I no longer live in Essex, but I write about Essex. Obviously, I'm not as far away from Essex as New Zealand is from Ireland, but there is a certain, I detected a great deal of warmth and affection in this book, which we will talk about later, and we'll talk about the importance of feeling in a novel. But there was a real, it seemed to me, grappling with the very beautiful and grotesque and actually sometimes quite disturbing details that make up a nationality. And, you know, I suppose it seems a little trite to evoke Edna O'Brien, but it reminded me of The Country Girls in the sense of this kind of description, not of sort of 15 paragraphs on a sweeping rainy landscape, but building that kind of sense of place through details of the food that is served and of the language that is exchanged between a priest and a parishioner. Do you think being so far away affected you?
I guess you start to notice, you know, the absence of things and the presence of other things. So my background was in poetry, and I wrote a first novel that no one will ever read, to kind of learn how to write a novel. But I started writing fiction as a response to culture shock in New Zealand. I found the I wrote poetry in Ireland partly because I'm a very slow reader, and I found novels intimidating, and I found them kind of packed full of other people's ideas, and I felt like there was so much baggage, things that you had to remember, and they just weren't for me. I wasn't ready for them when I was younger, and so I read poetry and plays because they just seemed much more manageable. There was so much space around them, and there were plenty of them, in the library. No one was taking them out, and so and also conversationally, it felt like there was so much chat, in the country and in the culture that the quietness of poems was helpful, but also the density and complexity. And in Northern Ireland especially, there was a sense of the dark back room, that everyone was hooked around cigarettes, smoking and talking about, the Kieran Carson translation of such and such. There was this, like, everybody read poetry and everybody loved it. And, there's, Northern Ireland has got this wonderful kind of weird culture where you're allowed to care about things that other people think you're wasting your time caring about. But then when I moved to New Zealand, the people were so much shyer and had a different way of negotiating another person. Just the culture shock was huge. Also in terms of like weather and landscape, topology. I'd never been to the hill in Belfast because I felt a little intimidated by some of the neighborhoods that you had to go through. It felt like I wasn't a master of the landscape. Living within it, and this is very personal as well for the different stages you're at in your life. When I went to New Zealand, there was all this landscape and space and beauty, and it felt like there was none of that compression and conversation that felt right for poetry. So I started writing fiction as a way to feel more venturesome and to move through space. So I think that the very fact of being there is why I started writing novels. And then the fact that I was so far away, I think it made that novel, Wild Laughter, much more intense than it might have been. The voice is like really turned up and it's stylized. And so I think that intensity came from this feeling of when you're trying to tune into something intentionally, you hear it more loudly than if you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really, that makes a lot of sense of one of the effects of the book that struck me over and over again while I was reading it, that it has the quality of legend and of myth. Because as well as being very tightly pinned to the particularities of Ireland and of the crash and all of that, you have the chief, the father with his two sons, one rather more prodigal than the other, and you have these immense conversations around mortality, inheritance, purpose. There are scenes in it which seem to be, straight out of something like the Mabinogion. You have when Nora goes and stoops down over and over again, picking up potatoes from the field, and it's simultaneously like old Celtic folklore and the Stations of the Cross, as you say in the book. And were you conscious that it had this kind of mythical sense of being simultaneously pinned to the particulars and transcending that? Was that intentional, or is that a function of distance and imagination?
No, I mean, it was intentional in the sense that the voice of the novel sounded like he was making, closing the door of a room, and whoever was left in the room was going to hear the story out. And because of that, it demanded a certain grandeur. His narrative, he had to insist on its importance and its worthiness. And, a lot of the novel is thinking about self-worth and, and so he desperately, desperately needs it to be worthy of telling. And as a writer, I don't know my characters from the start, so I don't know whether their story is worthy of telling, or if I get to decide, or if I choose differently, and whether I'll follow it through just because I spent so many years on it when the character reveals themselves to someone I didn't know. But I love that. And I had done a master's in Irish theatre, and I love theatre. And so I was also, as soon as you have a gregarious, tells you how good looking he is, uh, rural Irish bachelor, pining to travel, but staying at home. You know, you can't help but hear all of the other men who've stood in his spot on the planks. And you know, the playboy of the Western world, and all sorts of different characters. But also, there's probably Irish mythology isn't really well known. It doesn't, you know, there aren't really any tales that I would expect anyone from another country to know of. But probably the most famous figure is called Caoilinn, and it actually, his name actually means the hound protector. And for the people who've read the novel, this will maybe be interesting, but this is a demigod, you know, an Irish mythological demigod, and I was very interested in the fact that at the end of the book, the three central male characters, each of them together they have all the attributes that would make for a hero, but apart, they're missing core attributes. And I'm interested in that, like whether or not you're willing to come together with someone to be a person, or to, you know, do what needs to be done. So there are echoes to Caoilinn specifically, and you know, and he has this scene where mythologically he has this battle with the sea to take out his grief and frustration from something that's happened, but he's got his sword in the sea, and he kind of has to be dragged to be rescued from the sea. And this, you know, it's such a like self-congratulatory type of heroism in a way. You're not going to do that unless people are watching. So I was interested in that. Like, I kind of wanted to allow myself to be charmed by the protagonist, but to know that ultimately he's like telling me the context in which to hear his story. I think I like that kind of fractiousness.
That's one of the really wonderful defining characteristics of the book, which is, as I mentioned earlier, this quality of warmth. And I think that this is a very overlooked quality in contemporary fiction, partly because done wrong, it becomes sugary and sentimental, and, you know, people seem in love with their characters when really you should be interrogating them and sort of holding them to account. But what you seem to do, to me, in this book, is to simultaneously mock and love your characters. So these two ludicrous boys and their poor wretched coughing father, they are absurd in their acts of valour. You know, there's a scene with some sheep which readers will enjoy if they're not eating a bowl of spaghetti at the time. And you're conscious at the same time that you have inhabited these men and understood their need to make these grand gestures, but you also know that it's absurd. And those two things together, you know, linked with the very real and deep love that they have for their father, has created this kind of incredibly affectionate and warm book. Were you conscious you were doing that, or did you arrive at the end and think, oh, this is, you know, I became very fond of them?
No, I mean, actually, the last 3 pages of the book were, I can't obviously spoil it for listeners, but they were like shocking to me. Like, I wrote them all in one go, and I was kind of like, I mean, to say that I wept would be a bit, but I did. I mean, I think you can't write a book from a position of judgment. You know, there's a certain inevitability of judgment, but I kind of I would write about any character that asks to be written about, and you know, you know, there's going to be some reason you're writing about them, and I do think that real life is full of contradictory people, you know, and people who let themselves down frequently, and I mean, I do think that fiction is too often a bit clear cut, especially for female characters on the hero, you know, anti-hero line. You know, my last book, Orchid and the Wasp, the protagonist of that novel, that's a far more edgy novel, let's say, in the sense of no one's going to describe it as warm. But it kind of devastated me to the degree to which people wouldn't describe it as warm. I might describe it as, the adjective is failing me now, but so the character in that novel, it's a female character. She's her movement through the book essentially is that she's been given the rules of success by her banker father, which is to protect her privilege. She's white, young, beautiful, wealthy, middle class, has all of these things that he deems as being her privilege and her capital. Protect that, and also attain moral adaptability. And if you can protect your privilege and attain moral adaptability, you can succeed in late capitalism. That's the formula. And he teaches this to her when she's 11, and she absorbs it in a way, and then through the course of the novel, she tries to prove it wrong. And she uses other people's lives as kind of equipment to do that, which is reprehensible, but she does. And ultimately, that formula proves correct. And if she's to follow it, she can be a breadwinner for all sorts of people that have succumbed to downward mobility. But if she follows it, she's denying so many aspects of herself, her bisexuality, her the fact of her having respect or not having respect for people in her life. Like, there's just so many ways in which she will her kind of moving into her privilege will be a denial of who she should be. So it's a really tragic, like, the book is about cynicism and the moment that we're in and how we got here, but it's still a tragic thing for somebody to in their youth to contemplate that. And so I still found it a heartbreaking, warm and loving experience to write, because I was writing it from a position of, I'm not going to judge her if she does something awful, because I still think that what she's pursuing is knowledge, and she's trying to be cognizant, and that's a noble thing. It's far easier to kind of be apathetic, especially if you're kind of just take what you get and be glad of it. So this character, Hart from The Wild Laughter, is a very different character. I mean, I don't think he's as smart as Gail, and he's interested in proving something entirely different. And so because it's first person, of course I'm not going to write from a remove. I'm going to try and write from his perspective for real, not like not to use him as a puppet. And so it is. I mean, I think a lot of people who maybe have been at the bottom of the middle class or upper, working class, they have experienced a huge amount of austerity and being pushed into poverty. And this book is covering a period of austerity. It's a very difficult thing for people to live through. So it is, I guess, to be warm and tender in the sense that you want to show the humanity of the day-to-day life, getting up in the morning and working all day and going to bed and fearing for your loved ones not having healthcare or is not fair. So as much as people can fail to kind of be more truthful with themselves, or to be respectful of other people, or to just behave well all the time, it doesn't, to me, cast a judgment on the whole character. I think people are more complex than that.
This is a really interesting sort of avenue of thought, which is that at the centre of this book, really, there is a wrenching moral and, in fact, religious dilemma. And I won't say any more because I think that's one of the wonderful things for readers will be to discover that. But one of the things that drew me so strongly to this book was this idea that you are very keen on looking directly at matters of ethics and of morality, that you are very interested in moral absolutes, that one might say this is absolutely right and this is absolutely wrong, and then you come in and you say, actually, I'm not sure that we can look at things in this absolutist way. We need to look at the context around them. You know, there's no such thing as a good or a bad person. And I think that probably speaks to the heart of your feeling that people didn't understand Gale in The Orchid and the Wasp, because people are too keen to see things in this kind of binary Manichaean way. Are you very interested in that kind of like moral U-bend, if you see what I mean, rather than two opposed positions?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's what I'm always going to be writing into. I mean, I just feel that if there were as many kind of clear heroes and villains, you know, as there are in fiction, in the real world, we'd be living in a very different world. And it's not to say that it all kind of muddies into a moral mass. It's to say that, you know, every moment of your day, make a choice. And there's it kind of shows the spectrum of opportunity for changing. You know, I think it's a common trait that you start to kind of narrativize who you are to yourself. You know, and I think, you know, in through the Irish austerity, the idea that when things were going well and there was the boom, people kind of maybe internalized the fact that we are worth this, like we are worth not being oppressed, and we, you know, and maybe we've paid our, you know, we've done the time now, and then as soon as things crashed, immediately some of that culpability was taken on. You could hear it on the national radio, you know, on Liveline, these programs. I remember it non-stop, just being in shock, listening in the kitchen to, you know, taxi drivers who would come on and confess to the amount of debt that they'd taken on because the bank manager had told them, you know, your property has gone up in 20% by 20% this year. If you'd like, you can remortgage that, and you can. Yeah. And people thought that that was their wrongdoing, that they'd been so foolish, you know. And the fool thing is obviously very touchy with Irish people. Yeah. So you know, Punch and Judy and all that. And so they when there was the crash, there was this Catholic latent you know, thesis that austerity and self-discipline are your means to redemption for your wrong. Yes. And that is, and the fact that neoliberalism has managed to exploit, you know, this inherited ethic is really gross. I mean, there's just absolutely no way that people get what they deserve in the world we live in. And so, you know, finally, thankfully, Ireland is having is breaking away from some of the kind of unthinking kind of deference to authority and subservience, you know, and these just inherited historical traits that came from, you know, a position of oppression. Which is not to say that the Irish are always the oppressed. You know, they were. They did have some horrible parts to play in, you know, the colonizing, you know, of Australia, and you know, the story is not clean. But yes, yeah, exactly as you've been saying, it's not saints and sinners, and it isn't like that in history or in the world, and it would almost feel like a dereliction of your duty as a novelist, if you think novelists do have a duty, which I do, to kind of construct a world that proposes that there's any such thing as, you know, a good person who can always be admired, and they're always the ones that are put upon, and then, you know, there's the villains that do all the doing. Something that I find really interesting, for personal reasons, which we will possibly talk about shortly, is that your three main characters, your narrator and the three kind of pins of the book really are all male. Mm-hmm. Caoilinn, are you a woman writer? It's gotten a little bit dark. I'm shimmying around. Like, am I a woman writer? I mean, sure, I don't mind. So my name is actually reasonably neutral. There was an Irish saint that had a variation spelling of my name that was female, but there was another one that spelled it Keelan that was male. So I kind of, I could get away with
You could.
going kind of semi-anonymous. All right, I think it's a bit too late. Yeah, my first novel, the one that that was for practice. It was also a male narrator, and I wrote the first draft of The Wild Laughter before I wrote Orchid and the Wasp. So I was actually practicing still on a male protagonist before I wrote a female one, just because I knew that you can't help but bring extra baggage.
Yeah.
But to me, I don't. Yeah, I didn't feel that that I was a woman writer writing this male character. I was just writing the character.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons I ask, is that my first novel has a male narrator and a male protagonist, and I wrote it as part of my PhD, and when I had my PhD exams I was really castigated by my two female examiners for having not written a novel with a woman in it. Was I not a feminist? Did I not think it was my duty and my responsibility to be writing books about women? And it's bothered me, in the 10 years since, the idea that we should feel obliged to be sort of mouthpieces for womanhood generally, and should always take care to write from the woman's perspective as if that's our duty, when the imagination is not gendered. The imagination is formed by all sorts of things. And so I'm always kind of wickedly slightly delighted when I meet other, you're younger than me, but young women novelists who are just damn well going to write from whatever perspective they like, and never mind what.
Yeah, and it's also the fact that so Gail in Orchid and the Wasp is a very macho character, and I was interested in our women's participation in macho culture, not masculinity, macho. And then in this book, I thought, would the book work if I changed heart, and it didn't work. The dynamic between the brothers would have changed. It would have been a different book. And so it couldn't have been otherwise, I thought about it.
No, it's a really interesting point. Can I talk to you about the humour in the book? I was thinking about how to describe it to people, and I was thinking about a distinction between a book being witty and a book being funny. And I've decided that although the book is funny, I'm landing on wit as a way to describe it, because it suggests a kind of sharpness and wordplay, as well as a playing with ideas. And I'm wondering, did you make yourself laugh while you were writing it? Did you arrive at the idea of humour as a leavening agent so that it wouldn't become too kind of bogged down in death and destruction and failure?
I mean, I love funny books. I rarely recommend a book to people unless it's made me laugh. Not because I think it's a book, but because the enjoyment that I get as a reader from a book is so much to do with its humor. It doesn't have to be humorous throughout, but and so and also the enjoyment, like writing can be so horrible, so you want to have those days, like you want to have those moments where your characters like crack you up. And it definitely was the case with this book, I have to say, that they did crack me up. And often it would be like the mother character. I found Hart, the narrator, doesn't see her for who she is at all, and it's one of the his huge failings. But to me, she which I don't think is a spoiler because it's so not in the book that people will forget. Like, to me, she was kicked out of the convent because she was a sex addict. So you're not going to see this in the book at all, because he No,
I wanted to know why she was kicked out of the convent, but
in there's some characters who kind of get a sense of her, but anyway, Hart, the protagonist, can't see her at all, but also you can't see her humor. Like at some point there is a death, and actually on the first line of the novel, it's not a spoiler to say that their father died, and Hart says giving out about his brother, you know, who's in his like late 20s, who's home, you know, doing, and he says, you know, Cormac's doing chin-ups upstairs, you know, on the bar that's affixed between his bedroom door. And his mother says, good, he'll be fit for pallbearing, so. And that's like came out of her. Like that came out of nowhere. You know? And there was loads of lines that is just the sheer joy of writing, because they really do. I'm not funny as a person, absolutely humorless online. You know, really, it's terrible. I'm not funny in my family WhatsApp. Like I come in with all of the, you know, dark facts, and then my siblings, you know, repair that timeline with pictures of their and jokes.
I think I'm the other way around. I'm funny online, and then people read my books and they're like, dear me, which doesn't seem much fun. Right. Occasionally my best friend asks me if I'm ever going to write a book that is fun to read. I've said no.
The next one sounds like it might be the book.
Yeah, we'll see.
That sounds.
We have a couple of questions from viewers, and if anybody, I think we can. I've got a question from someone called Cassie who asked a question about 10 minutes in, and I've got a couple of other questions, but I'm going to keep you to myself just for a little bit longer. Can you talk to me about food in the book? I don't know, I think it's really interesting talking to writers about their work, because I know from my own experience that sometimes a reader will notice things that I didn't know was happening. And I wondered if you were aware how accurately and how particularly you describe food scenes, and never just for the sake of it. There will always be something happening around it. As if it has a kind of sacred quality or a kind of ritualistic quality. Is this a decision you made, or do you just kind of have an ear attuned to the sound of a knife on a chopping board?
I had no idea this question would come up, but yeah, the only obvious, I mean, there is obviously this like set piece dinner scene, which I was so excited about when I wrote, because it has so many characters in it, and I'd never done that before, you know. And I was just like, I was kind of, you know, walking around the house thinking, it's kind of working. Like, I think the reader is going to be able to see everyone, and they're not going to be confused. And yet there's
it was good.
I'm just, I was amazed by the fact that it seemed to be, but maybe it was the food that was holding it all together. But there is this kind of bowl of potatoes at some point, and because it's a potato farm, this is inherently funny. And the potatoes that they eat are all the cull potatoes, so they're all really nodular, kind of tuberous, and they're offensive, you know, the look of them on the table. And
I wasn't tempted to eat some boiled potatoes after that scene, I have to say.
Then I think actually probably this is turning into one of those awful things where you congratulate yourself on your own good lines.
Do you know what? It's your book launch. You can congratulate yourself to the rafters and then drink wine. It's fine.
But I mean, it was worth it for me to write a potato farm novel to arrive at the line, which happened as I was writing it, that the mother character, all of a sudden, she gets so stiff that it looks as if the potatoes that she's eaten throughout her life have all of a sudden exuded their starch. And when I wrote that line, I thought, that's what they're for. Otherwise,
it's like Pygmalion in reverse. Yeah, it's really just a wonderful kind of aspect of the book, and it fascinates me that someone published a book a couple of years ago, and I won't say who it is, and we'll say this person's name was Joe Bloggs. And I said to my friends, I see Joe Bloggs has written his novel again, which sounds really rude. But what I meant was that rather like Iris Murdoch, the person I was talking about has cornered the market in being themselves by a distinctive voice, a very distinctive intelligence, a very unique eye, and it feels as if only that person could write that book, you know. And it's very interesting to me that you've written two very different books, but also they are becoming increasingly Hughes novels, and it's extremely exciting for me to kind of be around when you are, and to be your contemporary, and, you know, to think about how you will continue to think about these things, about Irish identity, about humour and warmth, about ethics, you know, about storytelling. So
Very nice.
Yeah, I'm just blowing smoke up your behind now, which is perfectly permitted on a book launch night. I have one last question before we go and talk through a couple of questions that have been brought to it. How did you find, or how are you finding, bringing a second novel out into the world, being already established as a novelist? This is a really interesting thing in the publishing world, that debut novelists tend to be very fated and they become very exciting. But then there's a risk that they then are not invested with the time, and the industry moves on to the next debut novel. And meanwhile, the debut novelist is going away and writing their second and their third book and kind of working on their craft. Have you found this kind of second entry into the world, this second launch, very different, notwithstanding the fact there's a pandemic on and, you know, you can't go to the bookshop?
I mean, it's very hard to say how I'm finding it, in the sense that, you know, this is my first interview about the book. I haven't had the chance to really, you know, hear from readers yet. Hopefully they'll read it in the next, some readers will read it in the next few weeks, and put reviews online and things like that I can stalk.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is interesting. The second book, people are trying to kind of establish something that they can, you know, latch on to as a recurrence in you and your work.
Yeah.
For me, I think that people will draw the bridge of, you know, interest in social mobility and the family unit and this kind of thing. But I don't know how you write a novel that doesn't have economics in it. You know, so I guess for me that wouldn't be the what I would see as a through line. But you do, yeah. Also, I mean, this novel took 8 years to write. So this, and it has been through various forms. It was a novel, and then I turned it into a novella. And I put the novella, I felt that it worked as a novella, and I put it with a collection of short stories. And I sent them to my agent, because I hadn't written a new novel. And I had, you know, I assume everything I wrote before is bad. I tend to throw things out. And I hadn't even told him about this book. And anyway, I sent him the manuscript of the stories and the novella, and we met up, and he just said, "Why did you smuggle a novel into this book, this book, you know?" And then I kind of said, "Oh, well, it was a novel." And and he said, "Can I see that, what it was?" And I said, "No, like, I'm happy with everything I lost." You know, and he said, "Okay, but like, okay, it could work as it is, but maybe there's a few things I'd love to see more of," or, you know. So I just said, "Don't tell me anything else. I'm going to go away and think," you know. And so I thought for a few months, and so now, I mean, I'm really glad that it had that time. But it's the narrative of this being my second book, and it coming out 2 years after my first, will probably make people think that it was written quickly, and you know, whereas for me, this is the one that that I thought might never be published, you know. So yeah, as to the second novel and whether, I mean, not as many people read Orchid and the Wasp as I would have liked. So hopefully they're just discovering me as the first novel. First time.
I think it actually, as a practitioner, it doesn't surprise me at all to hear that it took so many years to write, because I'm so alert to how intensely crafted and elusive and poetic and worked every single sentence is, which is, you know, it's the kind of book that you can hand a page to an MA creative writing class, and, you know, they would get good terms worth of work out of studying it. Right. I have some questions for you from viewers, if that's okay. We have like maybe another 15-20 minutes. So Ashley has asked a question which you've sort of answered, but it's worth asking again. How many drafts did you write before you felt satisfied that it was what you had envisioned? But of course you envisaged something quite different.
Well, it's a good question. If I'm ever teaching, one of the things I always tell people about at the beginning, because young writers are always likely to feel like frauds, and that if they hear that an established writer works a certain way, and they don't work that way, they can then feel that they're not doing it right, and they try to do it as the established author does it, and it doesn't work for them, and they give up. So I think it's important to know that there tends to be two distinctly different ways of working, and there is a spectrum between them. But you know, Zadie Smith has a brilliant essay on this, and she talks about them as micromanagers and macro planners. And the micromanagers do brick by brick, and they, you know, if it was a house, they're also putting the mortar and their plaster and their painting, and they're laying the carpet inside the house as they go, so that you have the whole first floor by the time you get to the landing.
Yeah.
And the other type of writer will throw up, you know, will do a blueprint, will throw up, you know, the foundation of the structure, and they might, you know, fill in one room, or they decide that it just shouldn't go there and they take it down. They move around, so they work in drafts, in rough drafts, which can be radically different. And I am very much the former. I'm a slow writer, and I tend to write in one go. And I tend not to redraft too much. I do more editing. So I was still kind of considering myself in editing mode when I turned the book from a novel into a novella. I mean, I cut like 40,000 words, but I still felt that it was editing rather than drafting. And so it was a big stretch to add in sections, because that felt like very weird to me. I don't normally do that. But it still felt like editing, in the sense of like improving this bit here by inserting 2 chapters, rather than the draft. So I don't do the draft. I think I would find it so exhausting to think that you've lashed out a draft and then you have to go back to the start again. I'd be too tempted to keep what I had and rework it, and that would be so. I do think people tend to fall into those 2 different modes, so there's always been one book. It just took a long time to be good. Hopefully.
But as you say, it's so important that people don't mistake your way of doing it for advice as to how everybody should do it, because this is, you know, it ends up being catastrophic for new writers. We have a question from Adam, who just posted it in the comment section, and he's asking about what he calls stylistic micro decisions. So, for example, when you're working on a sentence, and I've lost his question now, but it was to do with observing the kind of poetic lexis or whatever in a sentence and working out whether you've inflated it too far and need to cut it back. How do you work on those kind of very minute little granular decisions of your sentences?
Yeah, I read aloud, and so in a very early draft of this book, there was a line that was buried into, say, the 3rd chapter. And a friend read the first few chapters, and he said, that line isn't ringing true. It sounds a little bit too outside the register of the character. And then I realized, no, I need to make that line the first line and change the register of all the other sentences. Because to me that was, so it was a helpful note, because I was hearing that you know, I had amplified it in my head more than I'd amplified it on the page. You know, you kind of add a voice in your own mind reading. So I tend to read aloud a lot, and then it has to sound, especially if it's first person, it has to sound like it can be spoken. But of course, for this character, he is quite kind of flamboyant in his, and he can kind of self-congratulatory in his way with words as well, and his way with women. So that's kind of what he feels that he has. You know, his equipment, you know, in his version of what gives him power are his looks and his interiority. And his way of exposing that rich interiority through language, because he's not that great with fists.
I have a good question here to ask you in a second, but I realised that I haven't spoken about Dolly. It is Dolly, isn't it? I haven't got the book open in front of me. Who one shudders to say to an Irish literary novelist, "Are you alluding to Joyce?" But you know, the mother is called Nora, and there's something wonderfully kind of sexually easeful and confident about Dolly and the letters that she writes. I wondered whether that was a kind of gentle, loving homage to Molly Bloom, or whether that's just one of those kind of mysterious soups of the imagination that you can't quite account for.
I think, I mean, in writing the character, I wasn't consciously thinking of making that illusion, but it definitely would have, been a part of my, just the neurons firing in choosing the name.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't, completely arbitrary. But yeah, I thought at some point I might write a novel about her. I really enjoyed writing her character. She's very the two kind of central female characters in the book. Kind of at first glance they might seem a little bit like types, and the book is very, very interested in stereotype and the fierce resistance of stereotype. And so both of them end up, I hope, kind of being something new. But Dolly in particular, she's and does add kind of a sexual energy. And I've done this first month of lockdown, when I found it really hard to write, I did a stage adaptation of the novel. I don't know if theatres will ever open again, if there'll ever be any possibility for it to happen. But in Dolly's scenes, I kind of wanted to make sure the show has got to keep her clothes on, but that the men would be naked.
Yes, I love it. Yes, very good. And this is so interesting what you say about stereotypes, because I think there's something very interesting about a stereotype, which is that they have truth in them, and that's how they land where they are. And what you've done so beautifully with the women in particular is to take the stereotype and dignify it and turn it upside down. So Nora is a Catholic Irish mother on a potato farm, a stereotype, but so much more clever and funny and interesting and dark than that stereotype would suggest. And I think that's a very interesting thing for a novelist to do, which is to present to the reader, you think you know where you are with this type, with this trope, and then to make it so much more kind of challenging and sophisticated, which as you can tell, I'm very fond of the book. Let's have another question. We have Words of Helen here, who's just responding to the way you talked about how difficult it was for you that the protagonist from Orchid and the Wasp was so misunderstood. And she says, are you anxious about how readers will interpret the complex men of book 2?
I think with the first book, it wasn't that I was anxious about readers misinterpreting. A reader's reading is valid. It was more that I felt that it said a lot about where we're at, that the kind of general, say, the review response and things, thought that it was about a girl who wanted to be rich, when it's clearly about the dearth of the possibility for wealth and ambition in the age that we're in, and that kind of desperation that results from that. And so it was more that the feeling that how can we not be more honest with ourselves? Like, why especially our middle-class white people, especially middle-class white men, so afraid of seeing unflattering portraits of ourselves? And like unredeemed, or on the other hand, not scolded by the narrative. Usually you either have, like, if someone isn't enabled, they're either scolded or or they have experienced a huge amount of trauma, and that kind of helps the reader. So that was what was bothersome, because it was just a larger cultural moment, I suppose. With this book, I think people will be more lenient because of the default of it's a fairly a romantic sounding dude.
The lads can get away with things that the girls can't. This is like, it's true in fiction as it is in life. And you think, even though they get up to some pretty desperate stuff, you're like, good old heart and his brother. God bless. Whereas if it was women doing these things, it's a very interesting position to write out into, and to be conscious that you're writing out into that space.
I think it will. I think if you're a female writer writing a female protagonist, people assume that you are on board with the ethics of the character, and that you will, you know, your ethics will be given literally in the text of the book at some point. I think the benefit of this book is I'm writing a male character, so hopefully there'll be a kind of assumption that there's a separation. I'm never going to write a book in which I describe how a reader should read the book. You know, for me, readers are like what I write for. And I would never want to patronize the validity and the generosity of the act of reading. You know, and also my books aren't complete without a reader. You know, there's some writers write books that work, you know, but mine don't. They're incomplete. They don't actually make sense without the reception. And so, and not just passive reception, but the engaged reception. So, I'm just hopeful that there are readers, and I don't care what they think. I'm just delighted.
No, there will be, and I think that this is, you know, one of the wonderful, almost magical things about the work of a novelist, is that the book, as you say, your book in particular, and I feel this way too, and I know many of us do, exists in the moment of being read, doesn't quite exist unread, but is that conversation. And it's really, you know, as a fan, it's exciting to me to think of that conversation being had over and over again, and we forget that books have a very long life, and that, you know, in 20 years, when there's been 2 more crashes in Ireland and elsewhere, people will return and have that conversation again. We have time for one more question, if you have time, which is that 2 people, Cassie and, I bet my computer's gone to sleep, Cassie and Becky, have both broadly asked, what advice would you bring to a new writer setting out on the path that, you know, that working on their first book, or even possibly just, you know, approaching agents? What would be your kind of words to them?
Oh, well, different words for the if you're at the point where you're approaching an agent, that's very different. If you're at the point where you're wanting to write your best book, know that, you know, you kind of set the bar for yourself as a writer. Nobody else will ever do that. So really try and set it high, you know, let yourself down if you can afford to, because you will end up somewhere better than if you'd lowered the bar to begin with. And write, for me, what works is to think about a scene, a kind of a person in a situation that I, for some reason, find inherently interesting, and to just trust that what you find interesting is interesting and will be interesting to someone else, and then kind of honor that by observing it well and giving it your full kind of self. And you know, a book extrapolates from a moment, so that's all you kind of need to do, to write something that you know, to write something that you can be proud of, to put the time in, because, you know, you are going to write a lot of embarrassing things before you write good ones, and you know, for every new kind of challenge. And if you are looking at getting an agent, or you're at that stage, know that your agent is the most important person. For me, it's been the case, like the most important champion of your work. You know, you'll move around editors. That can happen. It's not always pleasant to have to do that. But your agent will hopefully stay with you for your life, which means they call you if you have a bereavement, you know, which means that you know what's going on in one another's lives, and you trust that their notes are honest and are wanting to bring out the best of your stories. So that, for me, that's really important. I do get notes from my agent, whereas, like, you know, they've always been a little bit more minimal on the editing side, and he's my first reader, and so that for me is a really important relationship. Meet them if you can. And yeah, so many different bits of advice for so many different where on the trajectory you are.
Well, you know, we've just had a formal request from someone to start our own podcast, so you know we can cover all these other subjects in due course. Someone's just asked how much agents charge, and I just want to say they just take a portion of the money that you get for selling your books. You don't have to pay anything up front. And Damien Barr has joined us, so I'm just waving at Damien. Is there anything that you have burning like embers in your heart that you would like to say to the audience before I do one final description of how extraordinary your book is and force everybody into the bookshops to buy it?
Well, just to say, you know, there's something really beautiful about the fact that you're spending your Wednesday evening staring into your phones, listening to two ladies talking books. And I mean, I hope that you've been enjoying books during this crazy period, and that they've been anchoring, because, you know, books take a long time to write, and they inherently have within them a certain amount of pause. And we're in a moment that needs pause and reflection. So I hope that you have books available to you, and that they're bringing you some kind of consolation and just space, you know, mental space. Yeah, thank you for being here. It's just delightful, and thank you so much, Sarah, for doing for reading the book.
It's been a joy, and I've had a large glass of Malbec during the duration of this. Before I ask you, if you can, to do another reading to send us home, I just want to say again to everyone who's watching, I'm terribly hard to please and judgmental and never like anything, and I adore this book. Caoilinn, those of you who have read her first book will already know this, but is a writer of the most extraordinary intellect and wit and talent and style, and nobody is going to regret buying this extraordinary book, and particularly now. And as Caoilinn says, you know, we're living at a time where the pause that is built into a novel is so beneficial to the mental health that is taking a bit of a kicking, I think, for all of us. And this is funny and transporting and exquisite. And I'm going to ask Caoilinn to read us out.
Thank you so much. And huge thanks to the publisher One World, who have been never took a day off in this whole thing, and just working from their kitchen tables and even on furlough still, being supported and kind from their private accounts. And my Juliet, maybe my editor, has been a hero. I don't understand how she can be so good. Okay, I'll read a short little bit. Hopefully there's a funny moment or two. He's talking about his brother, Cormac. He was a bright young thing, my brother Cormac. His mind was a luxury. The face was rationed, it must be said, but there's not a body with everything. Part teeth, part pelican. Picture that menace of features. Close-eyed, limb-chinned, skin thick as the red carpet he imagined laid down beneath his wellies. Tall as the door he expected to be let in. When he was 12, he looked 20. There's a little bit of a reverb on the mic, just in case, see if that helps. When he was 12, he looked 20. The odd girl went in for such a harrow of a fella. The odd girl and not the even, on account of his chesty conduct and his brains. Not that he was liberal with his cleverness, but there was the atmosphere of it. Knowing at any moment something you'd say would be turned inside out like a child's eyelid to traumatize you, to show you the violence behind it that you never meant. Or maybe you did. As I say, I didn't resent in his mind. Early on, its potential was fearsome, but he cached it away too long until it curdled. He could have his intellect. I had the looks, the chief's mud-coloured locks, yellowing now like a stack of cut grass drying out for haymaking. Hey! Square skull, cultured nose, the kind of eyes you might describe as pea and mint soup, best served cold. I was shorter than my brother by a foot, but divvied up as good as David. I'd the emotions of every girl in the county Roscommon over a barrel, a fact he found hard to swallow in spite of, or maybe because of, the pelican chin. Excepting gobshites, I liked people, and I was well liked for no good reason far as Cormac was concerned. I'd zilch to contribute in the way of knowledge or guile or points for the home side, and sure, how else can a person be of use? Sport lent him an absence note for the farm work that needed doing, for the care work, for the life sentence. His absence meant my containment. Stay put, heart, he was telling me. Stay a mile wide of my circle. There's only so many circles in a town the size of Souterrain. What I did and said reflected on him, so he wanted the sticks brushed from my hair, the charm wiped off my face. He wanted me capable of summing sums and changing tyres, to be mad on mechanics, Newtonian and Fordian both, to know a stock option hadn't to do with cattle. But I wasn't after his or his boyo's attention, that panel of experts. Where we're from, infants get swaddled in Hessian sacks. I never bought into an alternative reality, no matter how low the interest rates limboed for the new millennium, no matter how you could go the whole way to Dublin on a test drive, and if you weren't satisfied, no one would lambaste you or demand a tenner for petrol. Cormac did clinch a deal with the new reality. Nothing daft. He didn't barter his youth as many did for a barge on the Shannon or a conservatory extension or an interior decorator or a rotary milking parlour or a personal stylist. No, he wanted a college education, a new way of life, less like subsistence, one that didn't stink of fear and survival, a challenge that called for grey matter, not grunt work. He did fast maths on how the island was transfiguring. One of them scenarios like, if you're on a train and it's going at such and such a pace in the direction of a stone wall, but it's absolute gas crack on the train, what are your options? Anyway, I'll leave it there.
I'm applauding and imagining everybody doing the same.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being such a generous and witty and wonderful writer and person. Congratulations again.
Cheers to everyone on the other end of this.
I've drunk all mine, but drink.
Night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.